All right, good morning.
Morning.
All right, now I already know that time management's going to be the challenge this morning, so we're going to be prompt and get started. It's been almost exactly 2 years since I've been in here to teach, because this was the first class I taught, so that hopefully you folks could get to know me before I hold away in the back, and we figured it was time to come back. So. Which also means that we've almost been here. We're days away from our 2-year anniversary in Bella Vista. Obviously, my main role here among the body at Bella Vista is to minister to young adults. And I love that. I've done that my whole time in ministry, done young adult ministry. These are the folks that are what we call millennials and Gen Z. They're between millennials, just for reference, millennials these days are between 27 and 42 years old. Gen Z is 26 years old to 11 years old. I find these generations endlessly fascinating. I'm just starting to get some of the Gen Zers and noticing some of the differences in those two generations. And it's really interesting. One of the reasons that I just love ministry is because it's always changing. It's always new. There's always something new to figure out. Not with the word never changes, but the people you deal with do. The culture does, and so finding new ways to reach them is fun. Finding better ways to serve them. I'm grateful for this congregation's commitment to rescuing a whole generation from falling away from the faith. And that's what we've done. That is what this effort in our young adult ministry is about. But as a result of working with these generations for my whole career, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of the church. These generations are fantastic. We don't have a lot of cultural Christianity left. And you can lament that, or you can be grateful for it. The folks that we've got want to be here, and they want to study deeply, and they want to serve genuinely. And I think these are good things. I don't think that we could have the level of success that we've had among young adults at any other congregation. And so I'm grateful for your involvement. I also see as kind of a secondary role that I've got here is to equip the saints. That almost sounds scriptural, that ministry is about equipping the saints for the work of ministry, and I see that as all the saints. And you all have kids and grandkids and coworkers that are in these generations that I work with, and I've got a responsibility to help you minister to them well. And that's what these 6 weeks are about, helping you to minister to millennials and Gen Zers well. The question in front of us for these 6 weeks is, how can we use the current cultural issues of our day as on-ramps to share the gospel? I think that there's tremendous opportunity in front of us to look at the confusion that we see in our culture and to build on-ramps between that confusion and the certainty of the gospel, the certainty that the gospel provides. So the way that I ended up doing this class is that I did a broad ethics class with the young adults sometime back, and we looked at a number of ethical issues from the ones that we're talking about in this class to technology, to politics, to reproductive technologies. I work with the fertile bunch. They're the ones that are having babies. Fertility issues are a reality, and we need to know how to navigate those in a moral fashion because not all of them are okay. So we talked about that. We talked about being a Christian in business because we live in Walmart land. And so we need to know how to be a Christian in business. Well, after that, enough folks out of this bunch asked about the issues of homosexuality and transgenderism in particular, which we talked about back there. And that's what we're talking about in here for these next 6 weeks, those two issues and proper responses to those issues. And so we thought that Jeff and I switching would be helpful for that reason and some other reasons. But here's where we are going. My clicker is not working for some odd reason. But here's where we're going. This week, we're going to look at how we got here. Moral relativism is the topic this week, how we landed in this spot where we are. Click one more for me, Aaron. Forward. There we go. Next week, or not next week because we've got brunch, but the next week that we're in here, we'll look at homosexuality and the biblical argument related to the issue of homosexuality. Then we're going to look at we're going to look at this sort of cultural credo that you've heard. Love is love, right? Is that true? Is love love? Then we'll look at transgenderism, doing the same kind of pattern. The biblical argument, which gets interesting because the Bible has about zero to say about transgenderism in particular, but we can make ethical decisions based on the Bible, even when it is silent. So we're going to talk about how we do that, and then of course the headline on this, the cultural creed for this is trans women are women. Is that right? And why is it not? Lastly, we'll look at what healthy sexuality does look like within the storyline of Scripture in responding to our children and grandchildren. And I almost took out responding to our children and grandchildren because by the time I got to this point, this class looks quite a bit different than the one that I did back there because I realized that I've got a very different audience than I had back there. But I totally felt inept to do that one, but I'll offer a little bit as much as I can, and then offer some resources to direct you. If this is a situation in your life, then direct you to some resources that are better than me. So that's where we are going. So in each individual class, what I'm going to try to do is go through the bulk of the material and then do the bulk of the material at the front end, and then the back end leave room for discussion. I do have a few discussion questions sprinkled in though. But that said, today is about laying a little bit of groundwork for how we got ourselves into the situation that we're in, because you can look at the world around us and you can go, wow, it's different than it used to be, right? I mean, that much we know. It's different than it used to be. Now, and so we'll get started with this question. And I have to tell my bunch in the back, this one's not rhetorical. How is it that you would define yourself? Somebody says, who are you? How is it that you would define yourself in terms of broad categories? I am blank. What are the sort of largest rocks that make up your identity? Ready, go. Okay, so you are your faith and for your religion, right? Your faith comes up quickly, the faith of many people. This would be one of the first markers for them, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever it is, religion would come up. Relationship status would come up as well, right? I'm married, I'm not, I'm widowed, whatever, right? This is a big building block that makes me who I am. Yeah. What else? Okay. Your gender. I am male or female. Well, that's true, but anything else? Occupation, your job, right? Like there are some people that you can go, yeah, that dude's an engineer, right? Like he just at his core, that's who he is. Looking at you, Mike. That's just who these people are, right? What else? Yeah, family heritage. We could even country you came from, region you came from, right? This kind of thing. Political alignment, right, is another big rock that makes people identify with. Okay, so There's a guy, a scholar, I think he's a sociologist, named Philip Reif. I'm using a good bit of his material this morning, and he traced how people define themselves throughout history, and what he came up with was the idea of four selves. Four selves. And the first three show the ways in which people are formed by various aspects of culture. Throughout human history, the way this has gone largely has been that people have formed their identity from the outside. They looked at the outside and they aligned themselves with that, right? And that they conform to that outward influence. The first three deal with that. So summarizing Reif's first 3 points, scholar Carl Trueman says, culture, these are describing these first three selves. Culture directs individuals outward. It is greater than, prior to, informative of the individual. We learn who we are. We learn who we are by learning how to conform ourselves to the purposes of the larger community to which we belong, right? So you've got a political alignment, you've got a regional kind of alignment, or religious alignment, and you go, okay, because I have that label, then I should act this way, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so the three selves that fit into this category are these. Reif says that each one of them had a place in history. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. You can see all four of these in all spots in history, I think. But you definitely see one that is dominant, right? Different spots. So the first is the political man. And Reif identifies this with like Greek and Roman times. Think the book he uses to illustrate this is Aristotle's Politics, right? Something of that nature. The political man. The political man is the man who finds his identity in the activities in which he engages in the public life of the polis, or the city. He attends the assembly. He frequents the Areopagus, where the philosophers gather, right? You remember this from Acts, where Paul preaches, Acts 17, I think. He is deeply immersed in what one might call civic community life. That is where he is. That is where he is who he is, right? The outwardly directed activity of political life is where he finds his sense of self. Does that make sense? You're a community-involved person, and you identify with your involvement in that. This is super true of small towns, like where I came from, right? You identify with your life in the city. And the next is the religious man. Someone who found, think of Canterbury Tales by Chaucer is the piece of literature he uses to illustrate this. So the Middle Ages is when he says this was dominant. Someone who found his primary sense of self in religious activities, attending mass, celebrating feast days, taking part in religious processions, and going on. Now, is that totally gone? Absolutely not. We still identify ourselves by our political alignments, by our religious alignments, but they had a heyday, right, when they were dominant. The next is the economic, I think the Industrial Revolution up till recently. He says the economic man is the individual who finds a sense of self in his economic activity, trade, production, and the making of money. Now, this is still incredibly common. Like, a lot of people identify themselves in this way, right? Because we're just coming out of it. It's still very much dominant. Now, given those three, what do you anticipate that Reif would say about the age that we currently live in? How do people primarily identify themselves? Yeah, the confused man. It's truth is to be found within myself. Identity is to be found within myself, right? who I am as far as who I feel that I am is my truest, most authentic me. These, Rife says, these three have given way to the next self, which is uniquely defined by looking inward instead of outward for definition. He calls it the psychological man, that is, that we're looking into our own psyches to find ourselves. It's a type characterized not so much by finding identity in the outward directed activities, but rather the inward quest for personal psychological happiness. This is the predominant mode of self-identification that we're in currently. And I think you can see this. This is fairly easy to discern, right? You take that to its, so at a surface level, it's not incredibly bad. Like looking inward to kind of self-reflect is not bad. It's good to be self-aware, right? That is a very healthy thing to be self-aware. But once you take this to its furthest extreme, you can see that it gets you into some pretty weird places, right? If all truth and the most authentic truth is to be found within me. Because you know and I know that, like, one preacher said, if you ever got in my brain, you'd probably pay to get out, right? Like, there's some dark places in there, right? There's some dark spots that I don't want you to see. And if ever I became convinced that what is in me is the most authentic, most true thing, that means those darkest impulses of mine also are truth. And that's not good, right? That is not a good thing. Now, of course, this oversimplifies the situation, but I think it's possible to see that one of these dominates in every age. So if you follow the predominant theme of our day, the psychological man, you will get a culture which now largely identifies itself by sexual identity in terms of your sexual identity is your sexual self is your most authentic self. That's kind of the far end of this, I think. That's at least where we are currently. I don't know if there's any room left to slide. I guess we'll see. But this is our inheritance from the sexual revolution, right? Where this kind of started. Where sexual freedom was lauded and a thing to be that we should strive for. These things don't happen in a vacuum, right? This is a long trajectory of developing thought. It develops over time. It's complicated. Sometimes the history of things is not a straight line to anywhere, but you pick up in a certain age, you dive off into a certain situation, and you end up finding stuff that looks more complex than what you anticipated, right? And this is definitely more complex than we might initially anticipate. You end up seeing results, I think, that don't match all the known influences. And there are reasons for that. One is that we don't know all of the influences because all the influences don't get headlines. And so we want to talk about some of those finer influences that don't make the headlines. And another is that we don't actually think as rationally as we would like to believe that we do. We actually have the ability to hold contradictions within ourselves, within our minds, and that not bother us because we actually don't think that critically about some of the positions that we hold. As an example, I wrote my master's thesis in church history on a guy named James D. Bales that you may have heard of him. He was professor, wrote a ton of books. He would have a heyday with this subject, no doubt. But and I remember being able to, I was tracing a transition in his thinking. And I remember going to my professor and going, I can't make a couple of the ways he's thinking make sense together. Right? He holds this view and he holds this view and they don't match and they just clash. And my professor goes, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. It's not going to. It's not going to make sense because you're thinking of him as being a purely rational person. He's not, right? There are loyalties, there are affections, there are emotions, there are personal commitments, and a whole host of other things that get in the way.
And as we look at these issues, that's what we'll find. They don't all fit together very well, right? But people are able to hold them even though they don't fit together very well, because we're not as purely rational as we would like to think we are. We'll see that in these issues. You'll see that in me. See that in your responses. And we'll see that in the arguments for and against the issues. And so to that end, I ask for humility and compassion as we deal with incredibly sensitive issues. A humility and a compassion that we must have because we follow Jesus. And we understand that as Christians, we believe that a healthy sexuality within our faith is one man, one woman for life. I'm not trying to convince you of that. I'm assuming you come to the table with that conviction as I do. And actually, the only sense of identity that matters has nothing to do with a gender label, but has to do with a label that we call the seal of the Spirit. Whether or not you've got it, whether you have it or you don't. That's the label that matters in this discussion. And at the same time, I want you to understand and to know that there are people in the room who are coming from a place of names of loved ones and not generic labels affected by these issues. We're talking about real life. We're talking about family members. We're talking about names. This is real life. It's not theory. And I want to hear love in your responses. So my commitment is that I won't say anything that I believe to be disrespectful to any people group as I attempt to speak truth, but I'm also not going to welsh on anything I believe to be true in an attempt to speak grace. In between those of us who are friends, let's commit to speaking truth and love to one another, respecting convictions that we hold in common, acknowledging diverse experiences that we have as well. Peter said it best. Even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to give a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Be prepared to give a defense, but do it with gentleness and respect. And very often, whenever we are unable to do it with gentleness and respect, it's because we don't know the issues very well, and we get overly emotional as a result. These 6 weeks are about moving closer to being able to do this with gentleness and respect. So you have a good conscience so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, for that should be the Lord, if that should be the Lord's will, than for doing evil. These 6 weeks are not about bashing millennials or Gen Z. They're not about disparaging people who have same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. They're not about reminiscing about the good old days. They are about learning enough to be confident and calm in our answer giving. And I'm only interested in building on-ramps to the gospel, not walls between people that God loves. Carl Trueman said it like this: we do not choose our time, and we must not waste energy lamenting our time. We need first and foremost to understand our time and then to respond to it with informed wisdom. Lamenting the situation that we're in is useless. I mean, maybe it's got a place. I just haven't found it yet. But lamenting where we are is useless. The call and the responsibility for those who are faithful followers of Jesus Christ is to look for on-ramps for the gospel to reach lost people. And that's what we want to do. We're not going to waste energy lamenting where we are. We only want to understand this so that we can answer with informed wisdom. And Ecclesiastes, my favorite book, reminds us not to say, why were the former days better than these? Because it's not from wisdom that we ask this. Indeed, it's not from wisdom that we ask this. It's from amnesia that we ask, why were the former days better than these? Because the devil just repackages sin and sells it under a new label. He's a master marketer. And it's fairly easy to prove. If we think about Southern slavery, if we think about the sexual revolution, we can tell pretty easily that things aren't worse. Things are not worse than they used to be. And we can tell this because God hasn't flooded the world lately, right? Now, I know that he said he wasn't going to flood the world again. I get that. But at the time when he did, he could find one righteous person. And there were more righteous people in this room than there were in Noah's day. Let's not complain, let's construct. So, is that clock correct? Good. So, moving back to moral relativism. In a world then, think of the first three selves, right? The political, economic, what was the other one? Religious man. In a world where the psychological man dominates over those first three, where your true self is to be found within you, in a world where the psychological man dominates, what does that say about the political, religious, and economic institutions that you now feel are trying to impose something inauthentic on you? Given that we're in the world of the psychological man, where your most authentic self is your inner, how you feel inwardly, what does that say about those other institutions that try to impose beliefs and values on you? Nathaniel said they are oppressive. That's right. What was your question, Stephen? I don't know if that's a good question. I don't know that it's dominant, but that way of thinking is dominant among our millennial and Gen Z generation. And as they get, and remember the oldest Gen Zers are 42, like they're running for political office. And so we're definitely coming into a spot where that the economic man is being phased out. Yeah. Yeah.
Our mainstream media, our entertainment is being, right, it's the loudest voice right now. It may not be the dominant culture type, but it's definitely the loudest right now.
Yeah, so I'll try to repeat as y'all respond. It's definitely the loudest at the moment, right? And as folks whose thinking is dominated by the psychological man type move into our institutions, then it will become increasingly so, right? But this creates a world of moral relativism, where if primary truth is found within me, but the primary truth is also found within you, then that means it's relativistic, right? It depends on the person. And is you can think of all sorts of situations where this is a problem, right? And so our culture makes all sorts of moral claims. Our culture makes all sorts of moral claims about the rights of same-sex couples and transgender people, among many other things. But where, we have to ask this, so where do moral standards come from? Where do people, Joe on the street, where does he say that moral standards come from? Well, some options are, we could say that moral standards come from nature, but are animals morally bound? Whenever a lion kills a wildebeest, is he doing something wrong? Is he committing murder? He's not morally bound, so it can't be from nature. We could say from evolution. But how do you explain unselfish morals, right? Like it's not helpful evolutionarily, if that's a word. Is that a word? That might be a word. From an evolutionary perspective, it's not helpful to care for the elderly or the disabled. So how do you explain those by evolution? You could say morals come from social convention, but morality by democracy has created some real atrocities. See the 20th century, like a good chunk of it, right? And so our culture has shifted. So the claim that I want to make here is that if morals are objective, if moral values and duties are objective, and any reasonable person will say they are, because most people would say, hey, that's not fair, And if you make a claim ever that that's not fair, that's an objective statement, right? Morally objective statement. So where then do moral standards come from? I believe that they've got to come from outside of us. They've got to come out from outside of humans, and they've got to come outside from human constructions and conventions. The only objective place to locate objective moral duties and values is in God. He's the only thing that's outside of us that could give such a law. But our culture has shifted the locus of authority from moral norms to each individual self. But where's the obvious problem with that? It's not livable, right? It is not a livable situation for what's true for you to not be true for me, and vice versa. It is not a livable situation. So the question is, are moral values and duties objective? And the answer is yes. It's fairly easy to demonstrate. The Christian philosopher William Lane Craig tells the story of a professor friend of his who had a student write a paper defending moral relativism. And when he had received the paper, he read it and he marked it with an F. And the student came to the professor's office mad and ready to defend his paper. He asked, "Why'd you give me an F? It was a great paper." And the professor replied, "Because you gave it to me in a blue folder and I don't like the color blue." And the student got even more mad and he said, "That's not fair." And the professor said, "But it is morally relative." So the professor took his paper and gave him an A. And this is the world that we're left with. If everything is relative, we have an unlivable situation. The burden of proof then is for the person who believes that homosexuality and transgenderism are morally acceptable. The burden of proof is on them to show that it is objectively acceptable, that it is objectively morally acceptable, that it is the right for all people, and by objective we mean that it's the right for all people at all times, in all places, regardless of opinion. And so to do this, they have to show that the source of these morals is outside humans or any human construction. And therefore, if objective morals and values and duties do exist, and God exists, and most people will claim that moral values and duties do indeed exist. I'm trying to find so we can get to a little bit of discussion here. Truman again said, while we might in principle think that it is a good thing for everyone to be authentic, that seems like you should be authentic. You should, right? That sounds like a basically good thing. We are also aware of the limits to this notion. For example, the person who experiences a powerful inner urge to harm or even kill a person would not be regarded as hypocritical if he were to resist such. We understand that not everything I think or believe even needs to be said, right? Much less practiced. There are limits to the truth that I can find within me. And I think that Christians tend to hold too much of the burden of proof when defending their position. We tend to take on too much of the burden of proof on ourselves to defend our position. So when I'm in a conversation with someone that I know doesn't see these issues as I do, I try to get them to think about how they can objectively hold a position. Now, I don't try to solve all the problems at once. I want baby steps in the right direction. So I just want to plant a seed of doubt to start. And I'll say something like this. I think that your commitment to compassion and tolerance are a good thing. Indeed, I think that your commitment to compassion and tolerance are Christian ideals. I think that you get those from God because you're created in the image of God, right? And therefore, you have inherent dignity and worth. And I believe that that's where your beliefs on these issues come from. They come from the fact that you're created in the image of God. So they start in a good spot. I just think that they go in the wrong direction. You and I differ. We just differ on how human dignity and worth should be practiced. I don't believe that homosexuality and transgenderism promotes human flourishing. I don't think that it is good for us. I see morals as coming from God, and that is an objective place to get morals. And so, because I get the moral imperatives from God, then I think that we should just practice these things in a moral way according to design specifications, right? And that's actually a very congruent way to live. That's a very congruent and authentic way to live. And it keeps me from applying certain moral standards to some people and not to others. And so my question for you then is how you would seat the moral acceptability of these issues in something objective so that you could apply it to everyone, right? How can you apply the acceptability of homosexuality and transgenderism to all people if the truth is to be found within you? Because it's not to be found within me, right? And so here we are at a spot that we can't get past, right? Okay, what discussion do you have for us? Questions, comments as we round out today? Like I said, this doesn't solve all our issues related to this. We'll get to some more specific things as we move along. But what do you have for the ground that we've covered so far?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't accept homosexuality or transgenderism. I'm fortunate that I'm retired. I don't have to interact with people at work. If I did with my opinions, I probably would have a hard time. I enjoy the fact that I can associate with people who think like me, and I'm not required to go outside that sphere.
I'm in a bubble and I like it.
I do.
Hey, there's something to be said for it, and to enjoying that. And it is a real issue with folks that are working in some of these corporate offices downtown. That they've got to be able to know how to interact with these kinds of ideologies, right? And to do so in a Christian way. Yeah.
I think we find problems in people not your age and in that position, who are in a position of leadership in the business world and are required to enforce an acceptance policy in the workplace.
Yeah.
When it's totally against your inner belief.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a Christian.
Yeah, that is. So it's one of the questions that folks from. So Mike talked about some of these company policies that are coming down as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. How do you interact with those as a Christian? That's a question that comes up in my bunch all the time. It's one that I dealt with at CASA too, when I worked for them. That was starting to come down as well. Ma'am.
One of the struggles I've had is I work at front desk at a school, and I put a rule because I thought it would protect that I would only use the names that were registered in my roster for me to take attendance. But I found myself contradicting myself because some people went by CC and I called them CC. And when there was a child that wanted to be called by a name that I didn't perceive as being her gender, I refused to do it. And recently she's going through a struggle, and I don't really think it's a gender thing. I really just think that this generation that's coming in, the teens that I see, they are just overwhelmed with not knowing who they are. They might even perceive themselves as animals. And so recently I have gone ahead and used the name she'd rather be called by. She does not dress in any other fashion other than a teenager.
Yeah.
And the reason being is because I found myself in contradiction with my rule that I set for myself, that I don't use a name that was on the roster.
Yeah.
And then I was okay to accept names that didn't bother me. So I didn't find that I was really fulfilling what I had made for myself. And I still struggle with that. I really don't know if I'm doing what's right.
Yeah. Well, so in terms of using names, pronouns, big thing, right, is I would just say and what I tell people is, I don't conform to the pronoun thing. I just don't. I don't think it's right. But I also want to be careful about how much influence I have with the person, and to understand that my reaction to something like that, I want to always give off a good impression of Christians, right, rather than a bad one. And so I try to respond in proportion to my influence with that person, right? And that takes some discernment and skill and prayer. You hit it on the head, though, I think, when you said it's an identity issue. At its very, very core, it's all an identity issue that transcends gender and sexuality and all that. That we're too inundated with information, I think, and we're too influenced by diverse voices to form a good sense of identity, right? And there's all sorts of reasons for this: the decline of the family dinner table, and the mobility of families from place to place to place. It kills identity formation, and so you start looking for it in weird places, right? Looking for identity in weird places. Is that a 5-minute bell? Okay, good. About another couple comments. Yes, Jack?
I'm in a work situation with homosexuals and people with recreational drug use, and it is difficult. I constantly remind myself that I don't get to judge them, and I don't have to judge them.
Yeah, that's right.
And when given the opportunity, I produce a good image, or do something or say something. This is wrong, and if it ever harmed my family, this would be a bad situation. I don't threaten anybody. I just have to constantly remind, I am not the judge here. But it is difficult to be around these people, and it is difficult, like, you're going to accept these people. I don't say, they're my fellow man, fellow women, and they're beautiful people, and they can do good things. But you have to constantly remind yourself.
Yeah, right. I had a thought that I just lost. So thank you, Jack.
Judging others.
Yeah. I mean, this is one thing is, we're much more alike than we are different, right? With everybody around us, we're broken in different ways, right? And maybe we just hide it better. We have to think about that. And the good news is, my job is to treat them with gentleness and respect, to be Jesus in their lives, and let God sort it out at the end. To do my best to share the gospel as I have opportunity, right? And I think that you'll find that if you pray for these folks specifically, that you would have opportunity to reach them, that you would find yourself having more opportunity to do so, right? Yes, sir.
We hear the word admonishing us to not judge. But we are okay when we are discerning. What's the functional difference between the two terms?
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I would say judging is like a condemning kind of thing, right? To say, discerning, so judging is a condemning, right? But to say, you're in, you're out, it's a harsher thing. Discerning is figuring out how I can interact with them wisely, right?
Well, the nature of this problem is deeper than that. It's going to forcing confirmation on everybody to confirm
Yeah.
the way they want to be. And even though it's considered sin or evil among a large group of the population, the few minority activists are trying to force the hand of all the Christians to follow along. And let me tell you, kids look at adults for training, subtle training. They follow the path that adults follow. And when adults start calling people by their pronoun, you're now spreading something that's not right.
Yeah.
So we're forced to help their agenda about that.
Yeah, and that will come out more in the weeks that we talk about transgenderism, and then our proper response to it. But we have to be mindful of the way that we interact with folks. I want to end here with a quote from Flannery O'Connor, as she said of the South. She said, I think that what she said of the South is true of individual Christians as well. She said, I think it is safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. While the South is hardly Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. That is to say that a lot of us carry within us moral values and duties that have been influenced by Christ and the cultural Christianity that we've received. Few of us actually center our beliefs around Jesus. We've inherited them from our Christian culture, but we don't really center them around him. Someone who is Christ-haunted is critical of the moral failings of the world around them, but often fails to see the moral failings within himself. And if we come at these issues from a Christ-haunted perspective, we will recognize, if we come at it from a Christ-haunted perspective, we will be combative and argumentative. And that's what we see in our Christian culture largely today. But if we come at them from a Christ-centered perspective, we will recognize that the dark places in the heart of those around us that have led them to believe this cultural narrative, those dark places exist in us as well. And they may be different dark places, but there are dark places in our own hearts just as well, and they're just as equally hell-bound places. Another quote from O'Connor: accepting oneself does not preclude an attempt to become better. Accepting oneself does not preclude an attempt to become better. You can accept yourself and still wish to improve. We need to see that in ourselves and promote that in those around us, because moral relativism exists in us all, whether we acknowledge it or not. That is, the desire to say that that's not okay, but it is for me. That exists in all of us. And we must fight it, and we must say, Lord, have mercy. Let's pray. Father, help us to understand the world around us better so that we can reach this world for you. Help us to seek out the dark places in our own hearts and shine the light of Christ on them so that we would look more like you. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.